Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hi, everybody. This is Fahrusha. Today is March 27th, 2018. And unfortunately, I am here alone today. Kate Valentine can't be with us, but we have still a very, very interesting show for everybody today. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about when I was 11 or 12 and 10, people used to ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I always had a smart aleck answer to them. I was a real smart aleck kid. And you know, the guy lived around the corner, delivered bread. Hey, so what are you going to want to be when you grow up? And I would say, I'd like to be a theoretical astrophysicist or a cosmologist. And that would just set him away. And that would be the end of that discussion. So what I would like to talk about a little bit before introducing our very wonderful guest is what cosmology is. Well, there are basically two things that cosmology is in science. The first one is it's a branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of the universe and a theory or doctrine describing the natural order of the universe. But the second thing is a branch of astronomy that deals with the origin, structure, and space-time relationships of the universe, and a theory dealing with any of these. So that's what cosmology is, and we're going to be getting into cosmology and word study, the etymology. On today's show, we will look at the development of our cultural cosmologies from the end of the Ice Age, which was more than 12,000 years ago, to today, where we have some people who have a fixation on UFOs, almost like a religion, and a kind of worldwide cultural myth of aliens from space that we get from films, to an idea of others as interdimensional beings. And I use the word interdimensional loosely because I don't really have a word that comes to mind immediately if we're talking about others who could be from another universe, another time, another dimension. That's what we're talking about here. Well, our guest's work is very rich and complex, using language and symbol to decode what the ancients thought and finding a rich coherence between cultures geographically that are far dispersed from one another. For instance, and I'm going to go back to words here again, the very word etymology itself has Greek roots. Etymos, which means true sense, and logia, which means study of. So besides helping you to understand the origin of a word, knowing its roots can help you understand other words with similar roots. Today, we will mostly go for an overview and hope our guest will join us again for a very detailed look at some of his ideas and theories. So without further ado, let me introduce Laird Scranton. Hello, Laird.
Hello, Fahrusha. Thank you very much for inviting me to come on and talk.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm going to talk a few more minutes first before I ask you any questions, because I want to tell people who you are in case they don't know you. Laird Scranton is an independent software designer who became interested in Dogon mythology and symbolism in the early 1990s. He has studied ancient myth, language, and cosmology since 1997 and has been a lecturer at Colgate University. He also appears in the unfortunately late John Anthony West's Magical Egypt DVD series. He is an Albany resident, I believe. And he has written 8 books on his own, pretty much on his own, and then he's written several other books that he has been a contributor to. So I'm just going to mention the 8 that he's written, and he can mention any of them throughout any of the show today because we want to give him as much advertisement for free as we possibly can. The first is The Science of the Dogon, Decoding the African Mystery Tradition. Second, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, the key to advanced science in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Third, Seeking the Primordial, exploring root concepts of cosmological creation. 4, The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol from the Dogon and Ancient Egypt to India, Tibet, and China. 5, Point of Origin, Gobekli Tepe, and the Spiritual Matrix for the World's Cosmologies. 6, The Velikovsky Heresies, Worlds in Collision, and Ancient Catastrophes Revisited. 7, The Mystery of Skara Brae, Neolithic Scotland, and Origins of Ancient Egypt. And 8, Decoding Maori Cosmology, and the Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture. Wow. Well, welcome. We have to have a little clap for that. All those books. You're quite prolific there and very interesting. So where shall we start, Laird?
Well, I think your question about what is cosmology is a really good place to start.
Good.
From an ancient perspective, okay, my work began with an African tribe called the Dogon. They're from Northwest Africa. And it sort of has moved geographically from West Africa to Egypt to India, then to Tibet and China, then to Turkey, then on to northern Scotland in the UK, and most recently it'll move on to the Maori in New Zealand. Now, when ancient cultures are talking about cosmology, what they're talking about is how they understand three processes to work. One is how the universe was formed. The second is how matter forms. And the third is how the processes of biological reproduction happen. Now, the way the Dogon priests conceptualize these three themes, they see parallelism between all three. They see that they are so intimately similar to one another that they actually describe all three themes simultaneously using a single progression of symbols. And those symbols are the symbols that Carl Jung recognized as being the archetypes. These are the familiar spiraling coils and the various archetype symbols. Want to say the circle with the dot, that's the sun glyph, is one of them. These are the archetypal themes and symbols. So the difficulty that creates for us with these symbols is that we can't really ask. It's not really fair to ask, what does a symbol represent? We have to ask, what does a symbol represent in relation to one of those themes?
Right.
As an example, if we're talking about the shape of a hemisphere and we're talking about it in terms of biological reproduction, then the hemisphere represents the expanded womb of a mother. And that makes sense because it looks like it.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about matter, how matter forms, and a hemisphere represents the expansion of mass. So these are parallel concepts. If you learn one, it makes it easier to learn the others. But it's all one package here, and whoever put the package together, I like to think that they were, to a certain extent, showing off by demonstrating that they could basically recite one alphabet of symbols and be simultaneously describing all three processes.
Sort of like so, as above, so below, kind of.
Right. That metaphor, the metaphor of as above, so below, it's trying to tell us that the processes that happen in the macrocosm, the processes of the universe, are in some way inherently similar to the processes of the microcosm, which is where matter forms. And the use of those symbols does demonstrate that they're similar.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of got your start with the book by Robert Temple. Is that where you the jump off point was for you? You saw that book, you read it, and then had some alternate theories or built upon it?
Could you repeat the question one more time? You broke up and I couldn't understand the question.
Okay. I'm talking about the early 90s when you first started to study this. I was saying that The Serious Mystery by Robert Temple was a kind of jumping off spot.
In 1975, Robert Temple wrote a book called The Sirius Mystery. And the mystery he was writing about was um, unexplained knowledge that the Dogon are a living tribe in Africa, and they have knowledge of astronomy that they shouldn't have because they are a modern day primitive tribe. They don't have access to telescopes. And one of the things they knew was that the bright star in the night sky called Sirius is really consists of more than one star. There's a second dark dwarf star that we can't see with the naked eye. It's even hard to see with telescopes because the dark star sits right in the glare of the bright star. So even until 1918, our astronomers didn't know that there was a second star there. But somehow the Dogon have known of the existence of the second star. They even know the correct orbital period for the two stars. The Dogon say there's a third star or a third planet in the system. Astronomers are still trying to confirm or deny that claim. But the Dogon were my entry point. I followed Robert Temple's bibliography to begin with in trying to learn more about the Dogon. And that provided me with a lot of good material that eventually went into my books. One piece that Robert was missing because of his timing, how early he was writing, was that there was not yet an English language translation of the French anthropological study of the Dogon religion. I had the advantage of being able to also refer to that. So there's certain references that he and I don't see eye to eye on, but I think that I attribute it mostly to the fact that he was working very early and I had the advantage of later help.
Well, that's very, very interesting. I think a lot of our listeners have heard some things about the Sirius Mystery, and some people, of course, are familiar with your work. But I think that a large amount of others who are primarily interested in UFOs, let us say, may not be knowing that much. Just as a side question, the Dogon of today, how are they threatened at all by the onslaught of Islam in their area?
Well, they live in a very remote region. It's surmised that back in the 1500s that in order to avoid assimilation by Islam, that the Dogon deliberately moved 8 hours across the desert from anything that you and I would consider to be civilized. They live they sort of eke out an existence as farmers and as artists. And it's a very priestly tribe. As a culture, they place high priority on preservation of original forms. One of the reasons the tribe was interesting to me is because they have rituals like ancient Judaism. They wear skull caps and prayer shawls. They circumcise and they celebrate a jubilee year. But they have civic traditions that are very much like ancient Egypt. And the traditions that they preserve date from the very earliest times in dynasty, the sort of the boundary between dynastic Egypt and pre-dynastic Egypt around 3000 BC.
Okay, wow.
They also have a symbolic cosmology that's a very close match for a Buddhist cosmology that goes along with a shrine called a stupa.
Right.
So the Dogon make a very good entry point into the kind of study that I've been doing. I sort of stumbled into it, but it's a great place to start because you have all of these pivotal references under one umbrella, so to speak.
And there is also, as I understand from your writing, that there is an entry. Not everybody is initiated. There's an initiation in the community for the priestly class, while some of the people, the common person, knows some of the secrets. You have to be initiated to know all the secrets. Is that correct?
Yes, anyone in the tribe, actually any person even not in the tribe, can potentially become an initiate in the tradition. What's required is that they have an active interest in it. It's the job of the student to continue to ask the next pertinent question of an informant. And as long as they continue to do that, they are, if the questions they are asking are appropriate to what they already know, a priest is required to give them a truthful answer about the next question. So in Dogon culture, there are the myths. There's myths that are treated like fireside stories that are told around the campfire at night that present a lot of the very broad themes and very broad symbols of the tradition, enough to sort of interest a person in wanting to explore it.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, women can study with women and the men study with men. And anyone, including the French anthropologist who studied them, eventually became initiated in the tradition. He was actually granted Dogon citizenship.
Wow.
And when he died in 1956, they gave him a Dogon burial.
Wow. Sounds a little bit like Seti in Egypt, the English woman who fell down the stairs, hit her head, and decided that she was once the wife of Seti, and went to live in Egypt near Asut and cleaned the temple of Seti the second. I might be Seti the first. I don't remember, but she stayed there for the rest of her life in Egypt, and it's quite an interesting story. Sorry for that sideline, but
no, that's very interesting.
Just hit me. So here we are. We're going from the Dogon, who you've told us a little bit about, but we could learn a lot more about, especially around the words and how they move. And from there, you moved to Egypt, where I've visited several times, and I find it to be an incredibly interesting place. So can we go to that point in our overlook of the situation?
Yes. Now, it turns out that the Dogon cosmology, all their cosmological terms, are ancient Egyptian words, or very many of them are. So we can use an ancient Egyptian dictionary to compare to and make sure that the Dogon word hasn't really changed its meaning over a very long period of time, that the way the Dogon priests understand the word now, the way they pronounce it, and the meanings they assign to it are very much the same as the original meanings that are documented in an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary. So that's one of the cross-checks we have on the accuracy of what the Dogon are telling us. Now, we have a similar kind of cross-check to Buddhism in terms of the meanings of symbols and the concepts of the cosmology. In Buddhism, the language is very different. It's given mostly in Sanskrit. And so you can't compare word to word, but you can compare concept to concept and symbol to symbol. And so anytime we want to verify that the Dogon haven't forgotten the original meaning of a symbol, we can check with Buddhism, and Buddhism verifies that they're right.
Now, would this be primarily Chinese Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism?
This is primarily Buddhism out of India that goes along with the aligned shrine that's called a stupa. The Dogon have a similar shrine. So the source I work from is a book called The Symbolism of the Stupa. It was written by Adrian Snodgrass, who is a recognized world authority on Buddhist architecture and symbolism. Mm-hmm. He is a professor with the University of East Sydney, Australia.
Okay. Well, so we're talking about the Buddhism of India as perhaps emanated from the original Gautama Buddha, who lived in the BC era. What, about 700 BC was the time of Buddha? Am I in the right ballpark there?
Yes. Now, the tradition actually goes back further than that. If we trace it back farther, we go to a philosophy called Samkhya, which is a cosmology. It's a companion to yoga.
Right.
It was originally a feminine tradition, and it's recognized as being foundational to the Vedic tradition, the Hinduism and Buddhism in India. So this is all the symbolism, even as presented anywhere, India, China, Japan, Tibet, all comes out of this same root philosophy. And certain references only survive in some cultures, not others. There are certain pivotal references that I was only able to turn up by looking at surviving references in Japan. In China, they had been overtly banned in 1100 AD by a Chinese emperor, and in other cultures, they had been disincluded from certain works.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Had you looked at all at the Bon tradition in Tibet as far as where that might fit in? It's just an interest of mine that I'm happening to mention.
Yes, only peripherally, and there are elements of this in most traditions in India. I mean, if we see Zoroastrianism, um, pretty much any tradition that came out of India in that era has elements of this. The Tamil, the languages of the Tamil, the Dravidian languages, are also keepers of certain elements of this information. There's a subset of Dogon language that connects to the Tamil. The
Interesting.
Dogon language is actually technically unclassifiable because it consists of 17 subgroup languages that are all very carefully preserved as subsets. So when linguists try to classify the language, there's no way to do it because they have elements of a wide variety of different languages. You can almost trace the influences of the tradition by following what those languages are.
And do all the people have access to all the languages, or some people have access only to some of the languages?
Well, these subset words are part of the everyday use of cosmological language in Dogon culture. It's not like there is a secret language that pertains specifically to inner concepts of cosmology that not everyone has access to. Only the priests know about that. But as far as the basic subsets across these 17 groupings, those elements all make up part of the language. Just like we in English, we have some words that originated in the French language, some in German, some in Spanish, some in Scandinavia and other places. We all have access to those words. It's just the Dogon have done a better job of keeping track of which ones came from where.
Good. Well, I want to talk a little bit about Gobekli Tepe and how that was a place that was buried 12,000 or so years ago, prior to the end of the last ice age. There are times when you reference that as about as far back as we can go, and I'm referencing you loosely, not your exact words, so don't be offended.
No, it's okay.
And I'm wondering about if we went underwater, let's say in the sea. Is that the Red Sea that's on one side of, certainly in the Indian Ocean on one side of India, that would be between the Turkish area and India, where many Indian archaeologists claim that there's some rich stuff from prehistory underneath the water there, which stands to reason if things melted after the Ice Age. Could we learn earlier stuff?
I think we could. Now, one of the difficulties is that we don't see written language appear until around 3000 BC. So anything we do prior to 3000 BC, we have to be creative about how we can justify things. The biggest threat to the work that I do is my own wishfulness. The human brain is wired in a way to find patterns.
Yes.
If you imagine children looking up at the clouds and in the summer sky, they're imagining pictures of animals, not clouds. There is no actual animal there, but their brain puts it together to represent something familiar. And the same thing happens with researchers, that they see resemblances, some of which are pertinent and some of which are not. And if you're not careful, you go off chasing off after what looks like a legitimate resemblance, thinking that it's a real thing, but in the end, it doesn't really tie to anything. So to prevent that from happening, one rule I make for myself is that interpretations always have to begin with a flat statement on the part of the cultures that I'm studying. If one of these cultures hasn't flatly said that a thing is true, that they believe a thing is true, it's not fair for me to put an interpretation forward other than that.
Right.
My job is to try to justify the legitimacy of what they're saying, to check out, could this be true, could this not be true?
And I'm going to move towards, I just want to go over the different places that you've studied before we get into some of the meat of the work. Skara Brae, I've been to Skara Brae. I've been to the Orkneys, probably one of the few people in my neighborhood who has. But I was entranced by the Orkney Islands when I visited there, and I did visit Skara Brae, and I did visit some standing stones. I made the tour bus stop because it was a rainy day and they weren't going to stop at these giant standing stones. And I ran into the center of them like a crazy woman, ran around from stone to stone, and ended up sliding down the muddy hill and coming back to the bus all covered in mud, much to the bus driver's chagrin. And in any case, you see Skara Brae and as an offshoot of some Egyptian knowledge, like a place, a small farming, fishing village on the coast of these remote Orkney Islands in Scotland. That this was a school of knowledge for the Egyptian tradition, or a tradition that predates the Egyptian tradition. Yes?
Yes. Now, to put this into context, in the region of the Fertile Crescent in southeast Turkey and western Iraq, we have at around 10,000 BC, 9 to 10,000 BC, we have the Gobekli Tepe site, which is a mountaintop sanctuary with standing stones and a number of beautiful carvings on the stones and so forth, that is representative in one way of very early aspects of the tradition I'm looking at. It's the first place we have evidence of it. It's also the region where we see the first evidence of cultivated grains, of domesticated animals, of metallurgy, of megalithic stonework, numerous other things. Civilizing skills appear all in the same era, in the same region. And so my outlook is based on what the cultures are saying. The cultures see their tradition as being an instructed tradition. There's a civilizing plan and a symbolic cosmology that were taught hand in hand with each other, according to these cultures, back in ancient times. I see that starting at Gobekli Tepe. Now, Skara Brae is a much later era. Rather than being 8 or 9,000 BC, it dates from around 4,000 BC and after. Really, the Skara Brae site itself, I think, is dated from 3,200 BC to around 2,600 BC. Now, there are unique elements in northern Scotland on Orkney Island, unique to the United Kingdom, where DNA ties it back to the Fertile Crescent region at about 6,000 BC. There's a unique form of barley. There's a type of sheep called Orkney sheep. Mm-hmm. There is a type of a mouse whose DNA has not been definitively tested, but gives every appearance of coming out of that same region. There's a very similar mouse that exists in that region of Turkey. There is also a burial tradition, a complicated burial tradition that ties to a tradition that came out of that same region in the Fertile Crescent at about that same time. So there's reason to think that sometime around 4,000 BC or before, we had people arriving on Orkney Island from the Fertile Crescent region, continuing that same tradition that started in Gobekli Tepe. On Orkney, what we see are structural elements that are recognizable to someone like me. We have a series of megalithic sites, these standing stones you were talking about, and other sites that recreate a series of shapes that are basically the alphabet of how matter forms to the eyes of someone like me, but set on a human scale. They were connected in Neolithic times at 3,200 BC by a road that led to the Skara Brae village. So it looks as if someone was teaching cosmology on a human scale, on a scale that students could walk through and learn about how these processes happen. About 100 years later, we see agriculturally based kingships. The agriculture was also something being taught on Orkney, or it looks as if. About 100 years later, we have agriculturally based kingships appearing at 4 regions around the world, all at the same moment against no real background of history. One place is in Egypt. The ancient name was Taru. Another place is China. The ancient name was Iru. Another place was Ireland, the name was Aru, and another place was South America, the term was Peru.
Wow.
So we would have naming conventions for the 4 sites that seem to tie together.
Well, that is very, very interesting and very telling. So, just to flesh out to the end of your travels thus far, we have New Zealand and the Maori, and I find that lately there is a lot more interest in general in prehistoric culture and ancient archaeology. There's a lot more interest in general in both Australia and in New Zealand as places that have a far longer history than was previously thought to be the case.
That's right. There's quite a bit of interest in those regions right now. Now, the Maori in New Zealand are a much later tradition than the others that I've been studying. I had learned very early on in my process, really after I wrote my first book, I understood that there was a connection to the Maori. There's certain common terms that the Maori had with the Dogon that very strongly suggested I was looking at the same tradition in both places. And I had started writing, taking notes and keeping information to write a book about the Maori. But it kept getting bumped by other projects that seemed to be more urgent and more logically the next step for a book. So I finally now have gotten around to writing and publishing the Maori book. And as it turns out, the Maori culture ties to every tradition and every language that I've studied. You can see elements of every era, even the Gobekli Tepe era, even the Northern Scotland era. And so had I written that book as early as I meant to, I wouldn't have been qualified to recognize those other connections.
So it was fortuitous, as it were.
Yes, very much.
I don't know if you're familiar. We had a guest on a couple months ago, a very nice woman, very well spoken and educated from Australia, who was talking about pre-literate culture and the way they worked on memory. And although her conclusions in terms of spirituality are probably somewhat different than yours, there have been a lot of concurrences between your work and her work. And the woman is Lynn Kelly with The Memory Code. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
I haven't read the book, but I've heard her name.
Yes, well, the things that she comes up with, just to relate this to what you do, and the second thing is actually as important as the first. And the first thing is simply that she sees this pre-literate culture, verbal cultures, where memory is a very strong attribute, that the priestly class, as you were speaking of, will have these societies to which people can become initiated within the tribe, mostly, unlike the Dogon, who would initiate the French gentleman. And they have secrets, and they are remembered with sticks and other things. They have little memory codes that they work on, and often these memory codes work on several different levels, much as the way you say, as above, so below. And so they have maybe marks on a stick that remind them when they walk to the 3 blocks to the west, they come to another site and they begin to recite that part of the tradition. That's the first thing. So there's a good deal in common there. And the second thing that I find equally interesting is that these pre-literate cultures do not have a strong belief in a God per se, like a one overriding universal God figure, and that it is more just I can't say the word mnemonic code. And so I wanted you to speak a little bit to the idea that the Dogon don't have, it's not that they don't believe in any overwhelming spirit, but more that they don't have religion in the same way that modern traditions look at it.
Well, that's true. The Samkhya philosophy that these things come out of is an expressly non-theistic tradition. It did spawn later traditions that were theistic, but where the Dogon see stages of creation, the Egyptians see deities. There's a process over time where what began as essentially scientific descriptions, so scientific that you can set them side by side, both descriptions and drawings, with scientific descriptions and diagrams, and intuitively see that you have a match. What started out as that, over time, becomes deified in certain cultures. This is partly as a result of symbolism. The Dogon don't have a written language. The priests of the Dogon tribe look down their nose on written language. Actually, Socrates did too. I have the book I'm currently working on will open with a quote from Socrates explaining that essentially the evils of written language. That if a person doesn't truly understand a subject, that writing allows them to represent they understand something that they don't really understand.
Well, that reminds me of Buddhism, too. Certain kinds of Buddhism, such as the statement, "I'm not a Buddhist." Because if you don't really understand the subject, you won't understand that.
There are great techniques for helping people remember things. One of them is this idea of parallelism, where you describe a thing once and the description applies to more than one process. That's the way the entire Dogon system works. The way they plow a field goes along with the cosmological process. The way they weave a cloth goes along with the cosmological process. And so the acts of daily life reinforce the instruction they had in the cosmology. It's self-reinforcing systems, basically. Same thing with language, that the terms that are used in yoga are precisely the same terms that are being used in the cosmology and represent in relation to a person what the term represents in relation to the macrocosm or microcosm in the cosmology. I have a daughter who studies yoga who will fairly often come to talk to me about some concept she's learned about, and she'll start the sentence and I'll be able to finish it because it's all the same stuff expressed in the same terms.
Okay. Well, I certainly am a great lover of doing yoga and understanding yogic principles. So I guess we're on the same page with that as well. So the concepts and the way in which these advances in culture and in understanding seem to all come of age in the world in a similar time, as in you were talking about those 4 cardinal places with the names that were kind of similar from Egypt to South America and from the north in Ireland to China, I believe you said.
Yep.
So things came together at a particular point, and people began advancing, if you will. If it is an advancement at all, it's a way of looking at it. It's sort of like thinking about the myth of progressivism being something to run after, in a way, something to look for. So what do you suppose started this? Who or what do you suppose gave this information to the people, humans?
Well, this is a difficult question. It turns on the principle I was talking about of interpretations beginning with what the cultures say. Now, I'm fortunate in that I have 2 traditions that are quite similar to each other, the Buddhist tradition and the Dogon tradition, given in different languages. So we know that one culture didn't just adopt it wholesale from the other. Now, both traditions are documented as being ancient. We have good reason to believe that they're both ancient traditions. So the suggestion is that each culture somehow managed to keep all of these details straight all the way down through the centuries, because a modern authority on Buddhism is in agreement with modern authorities on the Dogon tradition about what symbols mean, about what various concepts represent, and so forth. So we know, because there's still a match, that there hasn't been major changes in either tradition. Now, the problem is that the Buddhists flatly say that their most sacred symbols were gifted to humanity by a non-human source. The Dogons say, they take it a step further. They say that it was a non-human source, but that it was also originally non-material, which is a confusing question. Now, those statements put a researcher like me in a hard position, because I can take the stance that both cultures managed to keep all these complex details straight for thousands of years, but then somehow misremembered in matching ways who they got it from.
Right.
Or I can say that they kept those last details straight too, and now I have to allow the possibility that they actually did get it from a non-human source.
And perhaps a non-corporeal human source as well.
Right. Now, when the Dogon say non-material, they're talking about a non-material entity that was able to take action in a material frame, in the same way that we see with in the Old Testament, when Moses is on the mountain. There are cautions, strict cautions presented about the Israelites not approaching the mountain too closely because of potentially bad effects that could accrue to them from being too close. This is happening in a material frame. The Dogon teachers had a similar concern about what the long-term effects would be of them on us. So their solution to minimize that was to sequester 8 Dogon tribespeople at a time in a remote place, a place like Skara Brae, give instruction to those 8 people, and then send them back to instruct their own tribe members. Now, at Skara Brae, there actually happened to be 8 living chambers that comprise the village there, so that those, even numerologically, it goes along with the idea. In cultures all over the world, we have mythical traditions of 8 revered, quasi-mythical ancestors who were the bringers of civilizing skills. This is the mindset that both the Dogon and the Buddhists have. Even the ancient Egyptians flatly claimed that their written language was gifted to them by their gods. So we have traditions of instruction all over the world, ancient time instruction by someone who, if they did present us with these things, was clearly more capable than we were. So now what they're talking about is scientific concepts of how matter forms. Anybody who knew that certainly wouldn't have had a problem moving around on the planet in ancient times. So mobility wasn't their obstacle.
Right. And that's shown also in the way that people went between Africa and Australia by different researchers of late, that was quite a going route back in prehistoric times, apparently.
Right.
But so it would seem to me in these pre-literate cultures that didn't have a theistic approach, if you will, it seems to me that whoever were the bringers of these ideas might later be viewed as gods in retrospect by the post-literate cultures.
That's true. More often what I'm seeing is that processes are deified.
I see.
But yes, certainly if there actually were physical beings here that people were interacting with, there's every reason to think that somebody would have deified them.
Right. If some being comes down from the heavens and starts talking to you about theoretical astrophysics beyond your knowledge, it becomes godlike or angelic in the way that people would perceive it today. I have 2 thoughts on this. First of all, regarding Gobekli Tepe, The makers, the people, the beings that constructed Gobekli Tepe, are they 100% known to be 100% human?
Well, no one is sure who built it. I mean, in the traditional view, this was built by hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent region. It looks more likely to me that this was an instructional site. The carvings of animals, the beautiful carvings that were preserved because the site was buried for thousands of years. Each of the animal names, if we look at it in an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary for the names of the animals that are pictured, each of those animal names is a homonym. It's pronounced like a term of cosmology. So you can imagine a person who didn't have a written language, but knew the names of animals, walking up to one of these pillars and seeing a carved image on the pillar and understanding that this was the place where he was going to learn about a certain concept of cosmology that was named after that, or named in common with that animal.
Interesting. And to put it to a very kindergarten level, in other words, a deer and what one holds dear.
Right. Yes. And I mean, it comes down to things as obvious as a relationship between a hearth and the concept of a heart. Right. Modern language preserves some of these meanings. To show you how pervasive the symbolism is, most people, if I ask them what they think an owl represents, very many will say that it represents knowledge. Mm-hmm. I say to them, that's at least 5,000-year-old symbolism that, without having ever studied cosmology, you understand. That's how pervasive and how tenacious the symbolism is.
Indeed. Wow. And to move, to turn around 180 degrees and look at ourselves in the present and the way the UFO mystery faces us, here is something in very basic terms where people see something. People don't always see the same thing. They get too close to it, and sometimes they're injured. And it seems to have both the aspects of a material craft, which can disappear and become immaterial at a moment's notice, and furthermore, is being turned by some people into a quasi-religion.
That's true. Very true. And I do see connections to UFO encounters with the things that I study. And it is a dimensional kind of a relationship, or it's also a non-material to material universe kind of a relationship, the way things are described. In the mindset of Samkhya, universes form in pairs, one of them being non-material, the other one being material. The non-material universe is described as having perfect knowledge, but an inability to act. And the material universe is described as having imperfect knowledge with full ability to act. And so in the mindset of Samkhya, there are routine attempts being made from the non-material side to communicate knowledge and to induce actions on the material side. And those attempts take the form of very vivid dreams, of things that look like everyday coincidences of life, this odd behavior of animals, through divination, through clairvoyance, through many of the paranormal processes, the processes that we consider to be paranormal. Samkhya sees these as attempts at communication. Part of the difficulty for somebody on the material side is learning how to distinguish between which of those actually have significance and which ones don't.
And that comes back, I mean, what you just talked about is basically the meat of shattered reality, all those various different categories, from the dreams to the actions of animals, etc. This is what we talk about a whole lot on Shattered Reality here. But what about if there's more than one other, if you know what I'm saying? That's always been my suspicion.
When we talk about the way these universes form, ours is described as being the fourth of 7 pairs of universes. And those pairs of universes, the way they're described as forming, produce a helix. So the suggestion is that the potential for life, because a helix is the shape of DNA, the suggestion is the potential for life is built right into the structure of the system.
Okay.
So the non-material side is being presented as a consciousness, as having consciousness. As a matter of fact, when we get to the bottom of esoteric Buddhism, one of the final stages of esoteric Buddhism is coming to a visceral understanding that it's all the same consciousness, even though it's playing out on levels. One way of explaining that is there are certain dynamics that underlie how matter forms. One of those is the dynamic of what's called a dipole. It's an oscillation. It's what magnetism uses. It's two centers of energy that draw together or push apart.
Okay.
That dynamic replays itself all the way up and down the scale from the smallest microcosm to the largest macrocosm. The same thing is true about consciousness, that just as we can imagine that particles of matter are subsets of a grand source, a wave-like source of matter, so individual consciousness is seen as subdivisions of a grand consciousness. And in Samkhya's view, that grand consciousness isn't deified, it's just recognized as being there. But it's treated on, most often on an eye-to-eye level with our consciousness, that there's not a sense that one is hierarchically above the other. In the Dogon culture, the Dogon tradition is a very non-judgmental tradition, where later traditions like Christianity see good versus evil. The Dogon see truth versus error. They don't even stigmatize the concept of error. If you try to arrive at a truth about something and you're wrong, all that means to the Dogon is that you need to try again.
That reminds me a great deal of something that the philosopher Eckhart Tolle talks about and he goes back into the Greek etymology of the word sin, which he says, and I haven't studied this in enough depth to know if it's actually true, but I suspect it is, that the word sin comes from missing the target. So that when a person goes forward, and if in Greek they would be said to have committed a sin, this is in ancient Greek, of course, that they would have missed the target, not necessarily that sin would condemn them. You see?
Right. And if you don't have the opposition between good and evil, then certain other concepts fall out. There's no foundation for them. That you can't very well have a heaven and a hell if you're not looking at things as being good and evil.
Well, there's a lot of people who are breathing a sigh of relief right now after hearing that. No, but I agree. I agree. So
now, in the mindset of Samkhya, the permanent seeds of material creation and of material consciousness actually reside on the non-material side, in much the same way that if you're watching a television show, reality really exists in your living room where you're watching the show. It doesn't exist in the show. And so when the show ends, nothing has really ended. That's the way that this tradition looks at concepts of life and death. It actually uses the term in some cultures, episode, to refer to a life. And so certain things revert back to the non-material side at the point of a death. So death is not seen as an ending of anything. It's really just the finishing up of an episode.
So you drop one meat suit and go off somewhere else and maybe catch another meat suit on the return, or not.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, the Dogon don't have a concept of reincarnation.
Uh-huh.
They flatly say that the only aspects of reincarnation that they recognize have to do with the traits that are inherited by offspring.
I see.
That just as you look at your grandchild and see the traits of your grandfather maybe, or your grandmother, that's where the Dogon place the action of reincarnation.
Okay, so just to reiterate, where do you think the human animal was at prior to Gobekli Tepe? What was the nature of the human animal? I mean, as I had said, I'm part Neanderthal. There's Homo sinensis. There's a number of other quasi-human animals that probably interbred with humans, as the Neanderthal did. Modern humans who were probably Cro-Magnon people. Who were these pre-Ice Age people in your view?
Well, the Ice Age serves as a kind of gigantic block to evidence. And so we don't really have, we have very few ways of tracking direct indications of what happened before the Ice Age. But we do have some references, especially from the Dogon, that help us out. In ancient Egypt, they had very fond memories of something they called the first time, capital F, capital T. In Buddhism, they recall the first time that knowledge was passed to humanity by a Buddha at a place that they refer to as Vulture Peak, which is a pretty good description for Gobekli Tepe. There is a Vulture Peak in India that's sort of a memorial to that ancient place, which no one is quite sure where it was. But where in the same place, what the Dogon say is they recall a time when humanity was restored to culture. So the implication on the Dogon side is that there was a period of prior high culture before this era of instruction. So my best guess is that prior to the Ice Age, that there actually was high culture in many of the ways that some of our myths say. There's a perspective from which we can believe that Atlantis was a real place. Some of the evidence is ambiguous because the word Mu refers to a mythical civilization, but it's also a term that many of the cultures I study use means ancestor. Uh-huh. And so when they talk about Mu in a fond way, they might not be referring to a place, they might be referring to a group of ancestors. So this ultimately falls in the stack of open questions for me. These are things where I have indications that point one direction or another, but I don't have an absolute fix that I can anchor down as to what the truth of the matter is. The hopeful thing is that very many of the things that I write about and do try to anchor down are things that for many years represented open questions for me. I didn't have enough knowledge at the time to be able to pull it together. Eventually, the right piece falls into place, and suddenly a whole book's worth of information comes out. The last couple of books I've written, the material for the book I already had researched. I just didn't realize it all went together in a particular way. So one book took 3 months essentially to write. Another one took roughly 6 weeks to write the basics of the material because all these loose ends tie together.
Wow. So what's up next for you?
So I'm presently working on a book called The Plan of the Ancient Cosmology. And the outlook of that book is to try to describe in overview what kinds of choices someone must have been making to put this cosmology together, to talk about the symbolism, about the choice of metaphors, the methods of, as you say, remembering things without written language, the way that things are represented, the way that symbolism works, how symbolism is really it behaves like the language of cosmology. It also behaves like the root language of consciousness. One way of understanding that is when you go to dolphin shows at a place, places like Ocean World or Sea World in Florida, mm-hmm. Sometimes they'll give a pair of dolphins sort of freestyling time, and the dolphins will leap up into the air, perform some kind of a trick, and then dive under the water, and then leap back up and perform another kind of a trick. Somehow, in the short amount of time that they're underwater, they manage to communicate to each other what that next trick is going to be, so they both perform the same trick.
Smart, they are, very smart.
Yes. Now, one of the theories of how that happens is that they're able to use basically sonar to create an image, like a symbolic image that represents the thing that they want to do next. That their method of communicating with each other may be effectively a symbolic one. Now, we see the same thing happening in UFO encounters. There are certain responses that UFO witnesses report again and again and again and again, even when they haven't heard other witnesses report it, that follow the lines of ancient symbolism. Every cosmological term carries multiple meanings, and they're discrete meanings. So they're like a cluster of separated meanings where you can't reasonably guess the secondary meanings just because you know one of the meanings. And these clusters are part of what allow me to correlate words between cultures. It's an example. The name of the hidden god for the Dogon is Amma. The hidden god in Egypt is Amen. But both words also mean to grasp or to hold firm or to establish. Even the Hebrew word Amen comes from a root that means to establish. So these same kinds of clustered meanings turn up in the UFO encounters, where that when a UFO is seen to move away, it's associated with the color red. When it's seen to rise up, it's associated with, I think, the color white or the color blue. There are certain strong feelings that the witness reports feeling at the time they see certain actions happen. A woman steps out onto her porch and she sees 3 gray aliens.
Okay.
And they don't at first know that she's there, but then they turn and they see her and they quickly depart. But when they depart, she doesn't see 3 gray aliens depart. She sees 3 deer depart.
Yes.
The ancient Egyptian word for to leave in haste is a homonym for the word that means deer.
Wow.
So it's as if there's a sort of a dimensional or a non-material material translation, a telepathic translation going on, where what the intention on the non-material side or the thought on the non-material side is perceived on the material side as in a translated way, and the translations are consistent. And so very, very often, if you look at all these UFO cases, you can spot. I have a list of maybe 3 or 4 pages of examples where that's true, where what they report having witnessed goes along with these clusters of meanings.
The owl is one that's been studied lately. I can't remember the name of the gentleman who's written 2 books about UFO encounters and the owl. And
John Mack did a lot of the studies. He's a psychiatrist, and Bud Hopkins wrote other books. The owl goes along with Egyptian words that mean to comfort. It could very well be that, and these owls couldn't possibly be real owls, because very often they're 4 feet high, and there is no owl that's 4 feet high. So the people who are reporting these things, it could be that whoever's on the non-material side of the interaction is actively trying to comfort them. There's a situation where a witness reported 3 slender aliens walking across the field approaching his house in the middle of the night, and he knew he was going to black out. Well, the Egyptian word to approach with caution also means to faint.
Aha. Well, this is very, very, very fascinating, and I also want to mention another thought about the alien is that sometimes our mind, the thing about people believe that they're made in God's image, or so we're led to believe. But I think we make God in our image, and I think that something that is smarter than us can make us see them however they wish to make us see them, through whatever memory, going into our repository of images and selecting a suitable memory to.
Well, that might be true. I mean, imagine someone who perfectly understood what these automatic translations are, that if they wanted to represent a particular thing, perhaps simply by feeling or strongly thinking about the corresponding, the non-material equivalent of what that translated image is, perhaps they can cause us to see that image. If by trying to comfort us, they can make us see an owl, maybe by feeling another strong feeling, they can make us see something else.
Well, this has just been incredibly interesting, Laird Scranton here with Shattered Reality podcast. This is Fahrusha. We're going to have to say goodbye for today, but we would really like to extend you an invitation to come back on and maybe discuss something like the Velikovsky heresies or some other aspect of your various studies, which are really just no end of fascinating. We hardly even got started today, and you've left me with so many more questions and a lot of interesting thought to come. So thank you so much, Laird Scranton.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to discuss these things.
Our pleasure entirely. Bye for now. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Laird Scranton, and he is just really such a rich repository of knowledge. Our next guest, if all things pan out as we would like them to, will be Mark Boccuzzi, who is with the Windbridge Institute and who is working with studies of intentionality, amongst other things. And I would like to remind everyone to please like us on Facebook, like us at our two websites, which are shatteredrealitypodcast.com and shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com. And be sure to check us out on YouTube and iTunes, where we have a presence on both of those places, and maybe on Sketcher. I'm not sure. We have to go back and look at that. But please feel free to contact us if you have a listener experience that you would like to share. You can contact us on any of those places. Preferably, you would contact us on one of our two actual websites, and I'm going to mention those again: shatteredrealitypodcast.com and shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com. So until next time, I'm going to say goodbye for myself and our unseen helpers here. So goodbye from Shattered Reality.